Yeah, so our first question up, he wants to know, how can you identify that you're reaching a dangerous level of stress and need help versus typical stress? And it'll go away with time.
Okay, so um, usually what we look at is how much it's impairing your ability to function. So like a normal everyday stress, which as we know, stress is normal. We all feel it. And so if it's normal stress, then usually we can cope with the stress and then move on and not let it impact our everyday life. So it doesn't impact our ability to function. It doesn't impact, our everyday life or anything like that. Granted, I mean, you might feel anxious before a test, or, anxiety might impact like your how well you do on a test. But it's not going to impact relationships or, your functioning at work or anything like that. So when we start to notice that it is impacting different areas of our life, like our relationships, like our ability to perform at a job, like our school performance, sleeping, eating, like those everyday life activities, if we're noticing that there's an impairment there, that's when we start to say, this could be a little bit more than just normal everyday stress. um, and so that's really what we start to look at, and it's individualized for everybody. So I think that's what makes it, there's not like a blanket statement of like, when you see this one symptom, then all of a sudden that's too much stress, because we all might experience that one symptom very differently. um, so I think we want to be really cognizant of not just saying like there's this one thing and this is what it means to have too much stress. It's very individualized. It's going to look differently for everybody, but if we notice that it starts to impact our everyday life, then long term too, then we should start to be concerned.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think sometimes something in myself that I notice is just like absent-minded things, or I'll start to put my keys in my fridge, or I'll be
Mm-hmm.
pulling like just random stuff, or I'll say the wrong words for things. And I'm like, okay, you have to slow down, like
Yeah.
something, if you can't get this in check soon, it might be time to talk to someone else about it.
And too, like those physical symptoms, I think are really important. Like we often don't equate physical health and mental health together, but they very much are linked. And so just trying to look at those two the same way, where, we're saying, if you're starting to have those physical symptoms of stress and you're starting to feel really overwhelmed, you notice it in the lack of sleep that you're getting, or that you're starting to get sick. And it might not, especially with us being inside all the time and, a little bit more, frequently, um, we're probably not as likely to get sick from something in the environment. So if you're getting sick and you don't know why, or you're getting a lot of headaches and you don't know why, it could very well be too much stress. And for those of you that are just joining us, welcome. I don't know who all has hopped on. I can't see names or anything. But if you're joining us, we are having a live Q&A. My name is Shelby. I am a mental health clinician with Columbus State at the Delaware Campus. And if you put a question in the chat, you are entered to win a $25 gift card. So please post any potential questions that you have about mental health, substance use, college stress, anything. This is your opportunity to ask a counselor.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. All right, and we've had some questions over the past 2 weeks from students come in, so I'll slowly be asking those questions kind of in between. Hopefully we have another counselor that's going to be jumping on, but she's having a little bit of technical difficulty. So thankfully Shelby's here and she can keep right along going. So this next question is, what advice can you give a college student who works and goes to school full time? How to not feel overwhelmed when college, when you're struggling and you have like mental health issues too.
Okay. So it's like a multi-tiered question. It's hard because again, it's very individualized as to what people feel is doable for them. So say, you're going to school full time, you're working, finding that balance and having a routine and having a schedule is like absolutely vital. So making sure that you're not, that you have a certain time scheduled every day, that this is the time when you're doing your homework, for instance, or this is the time when we aren't doing anything, which is also really important. I think that is often significantly neglected, especially when we have these really busy schedules. We think like, oh, we just have to like go, 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 go. And the problem with that is that we're not giving ourselves any space to stop and relax. And
so Shelby's going to talk a little bit about how you would secure a counselor in the community if you're not a current student with us. And then I will jump into our next question, and Shirita, you'll be up.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah. So within the community, there's a couple different options. So you can, if you have insurance, a good place to start would be contacting your insurance company and asking for a referral of, who's in network. Another really awesome resource is checking out the website Psychology Today. So Psychology Today is a website where it's literally everything counseling related, it's everything mental health related, and there's articles on there, but then there's also a section where it'll help you find a therapist. And what's awesome about that website is it lets you narrow it down as much as you possibly can. So you put in your insurance provider, you put in what type of counseling you might be looking for, if you already know that, if you would like to work with a male or female therapist, the general issues that you would like to talk about in therapy, and then it gives you a list of everybody that is taking clients right now, and you can contact them and figure out what works for you. And so that is generally the best way to go, I would say, for most people when you're looking for community-based services.
Yes. And if it's okay, I'd like to add to Shelby, if you go to our Columbus State website, go to Mental Health Counseling Services, and click on Self-Help Resources. It should give you an option on the right side that says Treatment Services. And when you scroll down towards the bottom, it'll have a little plus sign for you to click, and it has the community supports too. It also provides that names, telephone numbers, websites, and that's another place that you can access some information as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Shirita. There's a ton of resources on there. I think that it's an awesome, definitely a good place to start.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Whether you're taking a class right now, you're in between classes, the website is still open and free to everyone. So definitely look at that when you get a chance. And then maybe just some base level, Shirita, if you could answer kind of the differences between the different licensures and accreditations and degrees for counseling.
Okay. So maybe just a few, because there can be several. So you will see a designation of maybe psychiatrist versus counseling, licensed professional counselor, or even a psychologist. And sometimes what I see that kind of gets mixed up is that there's this idea or expectation that when you see a psychiatrist that they're actually providing counseling services for you. And the role of a psychiatrist just generally is to assess for medication appropriateness. And so those sessions may be much smaller, and that's their role. For a counselor or a psychologist, or even a social worker, more of the role is the talk therapy piece of it. And that's just working on what your concerns are, being able to talk through those, provide strategies like healthy coping strategies to help you through that, maybe teach some relaxation techniques, things like that, and maybe even utilize some other tools such as journaling, practicing gratitude. They'll talk about various things, but a counselor and a psychologist can diagnose a mental health disorder. A psychiatrist can do the same. It's just their focus is more medication related. I will say a general difference between like a social a social worker versus a counselor is that a social worker, although they can also provide counseling services, they have a focus of more case management and connecting you to resources within the community and things like that. Not that a counselor can't, but just the social worker has more of a focus. Shelby, anything that I'm leaving out that you want to point out?
Well, I was going to say kind of to follow up on that. I kind of think of counselor. So you'll see somebody that has a designation of like an LSW or LISW, that's a social worker. If they have a designation of LPC or LTCC, that's a counselor. And then there's MFTs or IMFTs, and they are marriage and family therapists. So we all do the same thing. So like I'm a social worker, Shirita is a counselor. We both provide the exact same service, but it really depends like agency wide, like what organization you're working with, they might do different things. So like, for instance, like I work for Syntero and we have a case management department, and those are generally made up of social workers. But then in the counseling department, counselors, social workers, marriage and family therapists, we're all licensed to do the exact same thing. So we're able to provide mental health therapy with really no differences across the board. Really the differences just come in terms of like licensure. So like what we're required to do by the board, and then our different designations have the capability of going out and doing different things. Like Shirita mentioned, like counselors aren't going to do as much. Like if they were to go into case management, it's a little bit more rare. Social workers can do more broad, but counselors are really only doing that therapy. So it just, those are the differences in that. Psychologists, Shirita mentioned psychologists, because I think this is definitely a common misconception that we get, right? We think psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, like they're all the same thing. Mentioned psychologists, at least, yes, psychologists can provide counseling as well. A lot of psychologists too are also able to do testing. So if you're if you want to get tested for ADHD or you want to get tested for autism, a lot of people that have doctorates in psychology are able to do that psychological testing that you would need in order to be diagnosed with that. Psychiatrists, I think, can also do it too, but they're pretty, like you said, they're pretty medication focused, so it's a little different in terms of their willingness, I guess, sometimes.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I think I hear a little bit of feedback, so maybe when we're not talking, if we could mute ourselves, just because so everyone can hear. And I think we mentioned just briefly, talked about some of the coping skills. So we had one question that was, what's your favorite coping skill personally? So Shelby, if you want to start us off, and then Shirita, you can answer after.
Sure. So, oh gosh. Now, is this personally as in like what I would encourage my students to do or what I personally do?
Let's go with, you could do both, what you encourage,
okay.
But personally healthy coping skills for your own life too.
Sounds good. So personally, in my personal life, I find that exercise is my go-to coping skill. We know that even biologically, exercise releases those chemicals in our brain that make us feel good. And so I have found that that's a huge stress reliever for me. So that is one thing personally that I do. Things that I encourage my clients to do, it's so hard to pick one because it's just such an individualized process. I really like to encourage my clients to practice mindfulness. I think that's always a good go-to because our society is so busy all the time. It can be really difficult to slow down and allow ourselves to stop and not have to keep going constantly. So that's why I like to encourage mindfulness. But then there are plenty of people out there that just don't jive with mindfulness, and that's okay. And so in those instances, I usually like to encourage people to like just get outside. I don't care what you're doing. Get outside and do something in nature. Nature in and of itself is being out there is a very mindful experience. And so I would say that's usually a pretty good go-to.